So you put the first verse of chapter 8 up. Yesterday was Prabhupada, what was that, recorded lecture. What's that?
From the previous chapter, the last 2 verses remaining.
Oh.
And the new chapter, first verse.
Oh my God. Because Natavar had me down as verse 2 of chapter 8, so we've got a lot to cover. I'm not held responsible then for running over time. So what, we didn't do the last 2 verses of 3.7.41?
Yeah.
And 3.7.42. Okay. Well, we'll read those and the purport, and then we will actually do verse 3.8.2, because that was the verse I was supposed to do, and that's the last one. Sarve Vedascha Yagyascha Tapo Danani Chanagha Jiva Bhaya Pradanasya Nakur Viran Kalam Api. O spotless one, your answers to all these questions will grant immunity from all material miseries. Such charity is greater than all Vedic charities, sacrifices, penances, etc. So the purport reads, the highest perfectional work of charity is to give people in general immunity from the anxieties of material existence. This can be done only by performing activities in devotional service to the Lord. Such knowledge is incomparable. Cultivation of the knowledge in the Vedas, performance of sacrifice, and distribution of munificent charities altogether cannot form even a part of the immunity from the pangs of material existence that is gained from devotional service. The charity of Maitreya not only will help Vidura, but due to its universal nature, will deliver all others in all times. Thus, Maitreya is immortal. Okay, so this is 3.7.43. Is that what it is? The next one. Shri Shuka Uvacha Saitam Aprishta Purna Kalpaha Kuru Pradhanena Muni Pradhanaha Pravridha Harsho Bhagavat Katahyam Sanchoditastam Prahasan Ivaha. Sri Sukadeva Goswami said, thus the chief of the sages, who was always enthusiastic about describing topics regarding the personality of Godhead, began to narrate the descriptive explanation of the Puranas, being so infused by Vidura. He was very much enlivened by speaking on the transcendental activities of the Lord. And so here is the short purport for this verse. Great learned sages like Maitreya Muni are always enthusiastic about describing the transcendental activities of the Lord. Maitreya Muni, being thus invited by Vidura to speak, appeared to be smiling because he actually felt transcendental bliss. So thus ends the Bhaktivedanta purport of the 3rd canto, 7th chapter of Srimad Bhagavatam, entitled Further Inquiries by Vidura. So, as we have been sort of looking at in this section of Srimad Bhagavatam, Vidura and Maitreya are conversing. Maitreya is the teacher. Vidura has glorified him and now asked 40 questions. And as we move into chapter 8, Maitreya will begin to answer those questions. And here, of course, one thing I point out quickly on verse 3.7.41 is that it mentions that this giving of knowledge is better than all other kinds of charity or penance or other Vedic activities, because it is actually the best thing for all humans, not just for Vidura, but for all people. So this is the para upakara. Yesterday I was hearing a lecture by Srila Prabhupada, and he was discussing this idea of para upakara, that all Indians should be giving this to the whole world, the best welfare. You know, we can give somebody food, we can arrange for eye cataract removal, or we can arrange for some place to stay, or, you know, many other things. But the best kind of charity is to give people knowledge of how to stop suffering. And that, of course, is done through devotional service. And so the Bhagavatam explains that process of devotional service. So this chapter is called Manifestation of Brahma from Garbhodakshaya Vishnu. So we will hear Vidura begin to answer these questions that, Maitreya begin to answer these questions that Vidura has put forward. So this is the first verse of chapter 8 of Canto 3. Maitreya Ubacha Sat Sevaniyo Bhatta Puruvamsho Yalo Kapalo Bhagavat Pradanaha Babu Viteha Jita Kirtimalam Pade Pade Nutanayasya Bhikshanam. The great sage Maitreya Muni said to Vidura, the royal dynasty of King Puru is worthy to serve the pure devotees, because all the descendants of that family are devoted to the personality of Godhead. You are also born in that family, and it is wonderful that because of your attempt, the transcendental pastimes of the Lord are becoming newer and newer at every moment. So we have a purport here. The great sage Maitreya thanked Vidura and praised him by reference to his family glories. The Puru dynasty was full of devotees of the personality of Godhead and was therefore glorious. Because they were not attached to the impersonal Brahman or to the localized Paramatma, but were directly attached to Bhagavan, the personality of Godhead, they were worthy to render service to the Lord and his pure devotees. Because Vidura was one of the descendants of that family, naturally, he engaged in spreading wide the ever-new glories of the Lord. Maitreya felt happy to have such glorious company as Vidura. He considered the company of Vidura most desirable, because such association can accelerate one's dormant propensities for devotional service. So the story of King Puru will be described much, much later on in Srimad Bhagavatam. And the Puru dynasty is, of course, what we see. The Pandavas eventually are born into that dynasty, as are the Kurus as well. But what's being pointed out in that verse is that there is a better mode of worship when one understands the Supreme as a person and surrenders to the Supreme as a person, as opposed to trying to merge by becoming one with Brahman, or as opposed to simply witnessing the supersoul within the heart, the way the yogis do. So the jnanis tend to want to appreciate the Supreme by merging into Brahman. And the yogis, they want to witness the supersoul in the heart. And both of these are inferior to the third possibility, which is to serve the Supreme Lord as a person, as the Supreme Lord is also a person. So this is what sets apart the Puru dynasty. So now we have the verse that I was actually to speak on today. And we will responsively read this. Soham nrinam kshula sukhaya dukham. Soham nrinam kshula sukhaya dukham. Mahadgatanam viramaya tasya. Mahadgatanam viramaya tasya. Pravartaye Bhagavatam Puranam. Pravartaye Bhagavatam Puranam. Pravartaye Bhagavatam Puranam. Yad aha sakshad Bhagavan Rishibhyaha. Yad aha sakshad Bhagavan Rishibhyaha. Soham nrinanam kshula sukhaya dukham. Mahadgatanam viramaya tasya. Pravartaye Bhagavatam Puranam. Yad aha sakshad Bhagavan Rishibhya. Soham nrinam shula sukhaya dukham. Mahadgatanam viramaya tasya. Pravartaye Bhagavatam Puranam. Yad aha sakshad Bhagavan Rishibhya. Soham nrinam shula sukhaya dukham. Mahadgatanam viramaya tasyam. Purvartaye Bhagavatam Puranam. Yad aha sakshad Bhagavan Rishibhya. Soham nrinam shula sukhaya dukham. Mahadgatanam viramaya tasya. Pravartaye Bhagavatam Puranam. Yad aha sakshad Bhagavan Rishibhya. I'm going to kind of cap it at this point because we've got a lot to go here. So the translation reads thus. Let me now begin speaking on the Bhagavat Puran, which was directly spoken to the great sages by the personality of Godhead for the benefit of those who are entangled in extreme miseries for the sake of very little pleasure. So I will say, and you please repeat, let me now begin speaking on the Bhagavat Purana, which was directly spoken to the great sages by the personality of Godhead for the benefit of those who are entangled in extreme miseries for the sake of very little pleasure. So the purport is, The sage Maitreya proposed to speak on Srimad Bhagavatam because it was especially compiled and traditionally comes down in the disciplic succession for the solution of all problems of human society. Only one who is fortunate can have the opportunity to hear Srimad Bhagavatam in the association of pure devotees of the Lord. Under the spell of material energy, the living entities are entrapped in the bondage of many difficulties simply for the sake of a little bit of material happiness. They engage in fruitive activities not knowing the implications. Under the false impression that the body is the self, the living entities foolishly relate to so many false attachments. They think that they can engage with materialistic paraphernalia forever. This gross misconception of life is so strong that a person suffers continually, life after life, under the external energy of the Lord. If one comes in contact with the book Bhagavatam, as well as with the devotee Bhagavata, who knows what the Bhagavatam is? Then such a fortunate, who knows what the Bhagavatam is, then such a fortunate man gets out of the material entanglement. Therefore, Sri Maitreya Muni, out of compassion for the suffering men in the world, proposes to speak on Srimad Bhagavatam first and last. Soham nrinam shrula sukhaya dukham mahadgatanam viramaya tasya pravartaye bhagavatam puranam yad aha sakshad bhagavan rishibhyaha. Let me now begin speaking on the Bhagavat Purana, which was directly spoken to the great sages by the personality of Godhead, for the benefit of those who are entangled in extreme miseries for the sake of very little pleasure. So, let me ask a simple question here at the very outset. Why would somebody engage in accepting serious miseries for the sake of very little pleasure? Why would somebody get themselves in that situation? Or why would somebody tolerate extreme miseries for very little pleasure? Oh, we're getting the microphone here.
Possibly because of ignorance.
What's that?
Ignorance?
Yes, that's one way to think of it. Any other? You were going to say the same thing?
Lack of intelligence.
Yeah, lack of intelligence, ignorance. So, essentially, those are the same answers, and I was thinking in terms of people do this for two reasons, one of which is they have no understanding that they're chasing after material sense gratification is going to get them into deep water. They don't have any concept of it. And secondly, even if they do have a concept of it, they're addicts. So knowing better doesn't always mean that a person will act on that superior knowledge. They will be forced by their own material desires to act that way. Of course, this is why we listen to Bhagavatam. This is why we hear about spiritual life, so that we can learn, and at the same time we're engaging in service which moves our body and our actions in such a way that we start to carve out a different trajectory in our life. Instead of being helplessly, hopelessly drawn to the material sense gratification that we have cultured in our past lives, we start to do something different for the first time. we start to engage in devotional service, which cuts that intense addiction to material life. And at the same time, we constantly bathe our consciousness in hearing about the miseries that will be gained for us if we do not try to engage in devotional service and avoid sinful acts. So both things are there. So today is the disappearance of Ramanujacharya, and yesterday was the disappearance of Madhvacharya. Well, both of these, important persons in our Vaishnava tradition almost have a whole class in themselves, especially Madhvacharya. You can talk on him. But Ramanujacharya we don't hear so much about, so I thought I would attempt to try to speak about him. I did some review of some of the things that I've read about Ramanujacharya, and we can see how tenuous this process of Krishna consciousness really is, that we can have a full-on understanding, and then literally 50 years later, 100 years later, everything can be completely confused again. We have Lord Chaitanya coming, in the 15th and 16th century, early part of the 16th century. And literally 2 generations afterwards, there was not much of any recognizable Krishna consciousness going on, That's the Supreme Lord coming, Well, what to speak of us. And of course, the reason I bring this up is, will ISKCON be able to continue to hold the banner and not get diluted or diverted or something like that? And the answer lies, more and more with all of you. That in 20 or 30 years, most of us who have actually had the opportunity at some point in life to brush across the life of Srila Prabhupada will be gone, and the GBC will be a different group of people. Most of them are all nonagenarians and octogenarians, so it's a vanishing group, and it's very important that we don't just superficially come in contact with the philosophy of Krishna consciousness, but we learn to not only understand it and recite verses, but comprehend how it all fits together in a pattern, in a network, So that way we can go on speaking in a way that will save those who are searching after pleasure and incurring instead miseries. So before, of course, Lord Chaitanya, around the 11th century or even the 10th century, we have also the same situation, that in India, mostly there was almost no understanding of the Vaishnava tradition. We had, the Vaishnava tradition being there in Arjuna and the Pandavas' time, and then with Parikshit, and then again it gets dropped off into nothing that really resembles very much. It gets mostly the Karma Mimamsa philosophy becomes very prominent, and it pushes out any kind of real understanding of renunciation or service to the Lord. And then Buddhism comes in, around the 8th century or so BC. And then we have, Buddhism kind of taking over India, with Emperor Ashoka. And then we have later, as the years cross on, we have the rise of Christianity. Of course, that wasn't in India, that was in Europe. And then we have the rise of Islam, and then the incursions of the Muslims into India with Ghazni and so on and so forth. And then we have Sankaracharya. And Sankaracharya puts some things back into perspective, but he preaches a philosophy that is very close to Buddhism. So sometimes he's called a crypto-Buddhist, meaning a hidden or covered Buddhist, because he doesn't preach about the personality of the Supreme Lord. Now, mostly all the teachers of India around this time, around the 8th, 9th, 10th century, most of them, if they have any knowledge of the Vedas, it's all impersonal, you know. However, in South India, because the Muslims never fought that far down to be able to create chaos, in the southern part of India, there was the Alvaras, and they spoke not Sanskrit, but the languages of South India, Tamil language, etc. And they had great Vaishnava personal realizations about the Supreme Personality of Godhead. But we have, if we take a look at it, the advent of Natha Muni, who was the Acharya, who had a vision to try to consolidate these various stories and teachings of the Alvaras. And so we have this happening to some extent, that Natha Muni is attempting to do this. And Natha Muni's son Ishvara Muni has a child, and that child will be called Yamunacharya. But Ishvara Muni dies soon after his son is born. Natha Muni then is hoping that his grandson, Yamunacharya, will take the banner. This is the Sri Vaishnava tradition of South India. So this is the Sri Vaishnava tradition. And Yamunacharya begins to go to learn about the Vedic subjects, and he's in a school of a Pandit named Bhaskaracharya. And at that time, there's a king, and that king has a Pandit whose name is Vidyajanakola Hala. It's a real tongue twister. Vidyajanakola Hala. I believe that's how it is. And this Pandit is just more or less a expert arguer. So he, at that time, to speak on the Vedic knowledge was kind of like a sport almost, that people would argue, and the person who lost would have to either be punished or pay a tax or become the disciple of the person who won. And so he threatened everyone that if they didn't pay a tax to him, he would defeat them publicly and humiliate them. So most Pandits at that time just paid the tax, you know. And so one of his representatives came around to the ashram of Bhaskaracharya, where Yamunacharya was as a young 12-year-old boy, and challenged Bhaskaracharya. But Yamunacharya felt insulted and said that he wasn't going to pay the tax, and that since Bhaskaracharya wasn't there, he would represent him and in the argument. So, of course, the next thing that happened was the little 12-year-old boy gets pulled into the court of the king, And when everybody sees this little boy going up before this big acharya, Vidya Jana Kolahala, the queen who is with the king, she takes a liking to the little boy right away, and she makes a bet with her husband that if the little boy defeats his big pandit, that he should give half his kingdom to the boy. And so the king agrees to the wager, and of course there's a match. So first of all, this big pandit, Vidya Jana Kolahala, he asks all kinds of obscure questions from the little boy, but he's done very well in his schooling, so he answers all the questions very adroitly, and he passes all the tests. Then it's his chance to interview or to cross-examine the pandit. So Yamunacharya asks the pandit to refute 3 statements. And the first statement is that your mother was not barren, and the second statement was that the king is pious, and the third statement is that the queen is chaste. So this is kind of, the pandit doesn't know what to do with these 3 questions. How can he refute that his mother was not barren? That would be saying that he doesn't exist. How could he refute that the king is not pious? The king's right there. He refutes it, he could get his head cut off. How could he refute that the queen is chaste? So he says, these things are impossible to refute. Then, my dear boy, you're just creating a problem. If you say that you can refute these, then you refute them and prove that they can be refuted. And so the little boy Yamunacharya says, all right, I'll refute them. So he says that in the Manu Samhita, it says that if a woman has only one child, she may be considered barren. And it just so happened that the pandit was an only child. So the statement number 1 is refuted. Then, the next question was that the king is pious. And so the refutation that Yamunacharya gives is that since the king absorbs 1/6 of the karma of all of his subjects, that therefore, since the subjects are obviously not all pious and some of them are quite sinful, therefore the king must have some of this sin. And of course, then the third question comes around, well, how do you refute that the queen is chaste? And so the little boy, the queen is blushing at this point. She doesn't know what he's going to say. And then the boy says that actually, since the queen is in contact with the king, and the king is a representative of all the demigods, therefore she's consorting with not just one man, but a whole huge amount of men in the personality of the demigods. So how can she be chaste? So in other words, he shows that these 3 arguments can be defeated or rebutted. And in this way, he wins the wager and becomes owner of half of the king's whole kingdom. And he becomes actually involved in politics, and he's a good king. But Nata Muni is disturbed because he was going to be the next acharya to keep the Sri Vaishnav line pure and to help keep the teachings bold. So what to do? So he asks his servant Nambi, or his full name is Hariya Tirumalai Nambi, to go talk to the now king, who is, the queen nicknamed him Alubandaru, which means someone who conquers all, so he's King Alubandaru, and Nambi doesn't know how to get in touch with him now because, being a king, you don't just go demand an audience with the king. So he hatches a plan where he cooks this vegetable called tuduvalai, which is supposed to give people better intelligence. And he offers it to the king's cook every day. And so every day when the king is eating, he gets this preparation of tuduvalai. And one day, Nambi just doesn't show up, and there's no tuduvalai. So the king asks, "Why has my tuduvalai not been cooked today?" And the cook says, "Well, actually, I don't cook it. There's this mysterious mendicant that comes and cooks it every day." And so the king says, "I want to see this man." So the next time Nambi is there, he's introduced to the court of the king. And so Nambi starts to say, "My dear Yamunacharya, you remember that one time you were going to be an acharya, you were renounced, you weren't involved in politics." And as he's preaching to Yamunacharya, he actually changes Yamunacharya's whole mind, and Yamunacharya then ceases to be the king. He gives up the rulership, and he begins to once again take up the process of pushing forward the real teachings of the Vedas. And he, as being the leader of the Sri Vaishnavas in Sri Rangam, in that area in South India, he has three important things that he wants to accomplish. But he sees that his disciples, none of them are really up to the task. And he sees that there is a very up-and-coming star, a devotee who is named Ramanuja. And he wants this Ramanuja to take over. But unfortunately, he notices that Ramanuja is going to the school of this one Yadava Prakash, who is actually an impersonalist. So he thinks, well, this is not good, because how can I talk to Ramanuja if this Yadava Prakash is his teacher, who's teaching him all this nonsense about impersonalism? So he's not sure what to do. Now, it turns out that Nambi had two sisters, Bhudevi and Sridevi. And one of the sisters, Bhudevi, becomes the mother of Ramanuja through Keshavacharya, who is, these are all kind of, more or less Pravarti Marg kind of people who are talking about, various Vedic formulae, but not really devotional service. So Ramanuja is born in such a family, and that's why he winds up going to the school of Yadava Prakash. And Yadava Prakash is this great impersonalist. And he begins to see that Ramanuja is quite intelligent, and he's very quick. He is able to deal with things very fast. He absorbs the knowledge that Yadava Prakash is teaching, and he becomes Yadava Prakash's favorite. One day, Yadava Prakash is being massaged by Ramanujacharya, and he's massaging him, and he's commenting on a Vedic verse, Kapyasam, what is it? Kapyasam Pundarikam Ekam. Kapyasam Pundarikam Ekam is the verse. And Kapi can be, glossed as monkey. And asam means the hind part of monkey. It's the predecessor to our English word. And then Pundarikam Ekam, he's saying that the Yadav Prakash explains that this Vedic verse means that the eyes of the Supreme Lord are red like a monkey's behind. And at this, Ramanuja can't, this is his guru. He's massaging his so-called guru. And he's very disturbed by this. And tears are coming out of his eyes. And his guru can feel the tears dripping on his back. And he's thinking that my disciple's disturbed. And he says, my dear disciple, what are you disturbed about? And Ramanuja says, that's not the meaning of the verse. And so he says, well, if you say you know the meaning of the verse, what is the meaning of the verse? And Ramanuja says, it means not a monkey's behind, but it means actually that thing which rests on the waters is meaning a lotus flower. And the Supreme Lord's eyes are red like a lotus flower. And this is the first time Yadava Prakash starts to think that, well, maybe this student of mine may actually be a rival of mine. And he starts to become envious of his own student. And he begins to think, I'm going to create a system, a plot, and I will murder him. So Yadava Prakash, on the plea of some parikram or pilgrimage to the Ganges or somewhere, has this plot hatched where he's going to murder, Ramanujacharya. But one of Ramanujacharya's relatives hears about the plot and tips off Ramanujacharya, and Ramanujacharya isn't there. So he's not murdered by his so-called spiritual master. But at this point, he begins to think that maybe the spiritual master, he needs to find a different spiritual master. Because actually, Ramanujacharya has been hearing from someone named Kanchipurna, who is one of the family friends. He's from a Sudra background, but actually this Kanchipurna is someone who has a Vaishnava perspective on things, and he does not entertain the Mayavad conception. And so Ramanujacharya is warming up to Kanchipurnam's view, and he's getting cooler to the view of Yadava Prakash. So the king of Kanchipura, so we've got Kanchipurna and Kanchipura, which is the city, the king, or the area, Kanchipura. The king has a daughter who is evidently ghostly haunted, and she says all kinds of crazy things, and the king is asking for help. So he sends for Yadava Prakash, and Yadava Prakash shows up with Ramanujacharya, and the girl laughs at Yadava Prakash and insults him. And then she says, but if I could get the dust of the lotus feet of Ramanuja, I would certainly leave this girl forever. So Ramanuja gives the dust of his feet to the girl, and the ghost leaves. And the king is very, beholding now to Ramanujacharya. And Yadava Prakash has been just humiliated in front of his disciple and in front of the king. So it isn't long afterwards that Yadava Prakash just bans Ramanuja from his group, so he asks Ramanujacharya to leave. And so Ramanujacharya is actually kind of relieved by this, because he was thinking about leaving anyway. And he begins to take shelter of Kanchipurna. who was teaching him about the Vaishnava tradition and so on and so forth. And evidently, Ramanujacharya was born around the year 1015 or something like that. I've forgotten what the year is, somewhere around there in the early part of the 11th century. And by the age of 16, his parents got him married, but his wife was not at all interested in spiritual life very much. And she was offended that her husband, who was born in this noble family, was associating with this Kanchipuram, who was actually from his caste a Sudra. So one time, Ramanujacharya wanted to meet Kanchipuram Purna, but he wasn't able to be there, so he asked his wife to give him some prasad. And his wife did it in a very neglectful way, and at the very end of it, she pulled the plate away with a stick and insulted him. Then some short time later on, she met the wife of Kanchipurnam, right, at a well when they were both pulling up water, and the waters of both of their pots got splashed together. And she was very angry that Kanchipurna's wife was there and contaminated her water and cursed her. When Ramanuja heard this, that his wife had done this, he told her, please just go back to your father and I'm taking sannyas. So at that point, Ramanujacharya took sannyas. And then at this point, this Periya Tirumalai Nambi had been, waiting for the right time. And now it looks like it was the right time. He's no longer involved with Yadava Prakash. And so he goes to Ramanuja and he says, actually, the devotees of the Sri Sampradaya want someone to really be the head of this Sampradaya and push things on. And Yamunacharya wants to talk with you. Please come to Srirangam. So Ramanujacharya starts heading to Srirangam. But before he can get there, Yamunacharya dies. He leaves his body. But when they go see the body, Yamunacharya has 3 fingers curled up. And so Ramanujacharya notices this kind of strange hand position that Yamunacharya has, and he asks, is this something that he used to do? Is there some reason why he has 3 fingers curled up? And the disciples of Yamunacharya say, no, we've never seen him do that before. And he says, oh, I understand that he must have 3 wishes. So we talked about these earlier, that Yamunacharya had hoped for 3 things to be established. And so Ramanuja, he says, oh, therefore, my dear Yamunacharya, although you're not living now, I know that you are in the spiritual world. So I take a vow that I will teach everyone to worship Vishnu. And when he said that, one of the fingers came open again, And then he said, I will make a comment in Sanskrit on the Vedanta Sutra. And another finger came open. And then he said, I will collect together the various teachings of the Alvaras and put them in Sanskrit. And the 3rd finger came open. So he had understood Yamunacharya's wishes, and actually he would do that. He would become a great teacher of the Vaishnava tradition and war against the whole Mayavad impersonal interpretation. Of course, the story goes on that Yadava Prakash is going on with his life, and Ramanuja is going on with his life. But one day, Yadava Prakash's mother sees Ramanujacharya, and she says, "My dear son, Yadava Prakash, this man is definitely a saint. You should take shelter of him." Of course, Yadava Prakash was not at all interested in hearing anything like that. But that night he had a dream where, he sees the Supreme Lord coming and says, "You should take shelter of Ramanujacharya." And still he's not inclined to do that, But he comes to Ramanujacharya and he says, "Why are you teaching this wearing of tilak and, these Vaishnava traditions? You were brought up in a school where we don't do these things." And at that time, Ramanujacharya has a disciple, and his name is Kuresh. And he doesn't answer, Ramanuja doesn't answer directly, but Kuresh answers his questions, and he defeats all of Yadava Prakash's Mayavadi understandings. And in this way, eventually, Yadava Prakash takes shelter of Ramanujacharya. And so there's a lot more to to this story that goes on for another probably 10 minutes or 15 minutes, but I should probably end here. So I'll see, we're already 5 minutes over, but any questions or comments from anyone about this whole section about the Bhagavatam or Yamunacharya, Natamuni, or Ramanujacharya? Yeah.
I was just wondering about the philosophy of Visishtadvaita, because Visishtadvaita means
right.
special type of Advaita.
Yeah, Vishishta is purified oneness.
So can you just give it?
Oh, okay. Well, I'll give what little I understand or remember about Vishishtadvaita. Our Bhakti Siddhanta Sarasvati had a temple made in India, where all four of the sampradayas, the Shri, the Brahma Sampradaya, the Kumara, and the Rudra Sampradaya, would be represented. And each one had an answer to the Mayavad tradition, Now the Shri Sampradaya had the answer of Vishishta Dvaita. Advaita means, Dvaita means two, Dvai, Dvai, so that means two. So Advaita means not two. In other words, one. So Advaita is the it was the prominent understanding of the Vedic knowledge in India at the time, as we said before, except in South India, where there were some Alvars and people following those Alvars. So in what way is it one? And in what way is it not one? So Ramanuja's version of it, as far as I understand, is purified oneness, that it is that we are one with God, but we are purified in some way, that oneness is, or the oneness itself is purified. I don't remember exactly in detail how that works philosophically, and I didn't read it this morning, so I don't have it fresh in my mind. But we can see that this is the way that people get lost in Mayavad philosophy. They think in terms of everything being one. As a matter of fact, that's what Yadava Prakash was teaching. He was teaching this idea that he was speaking Sarva Kalam Idam Brahman, and generally Mayavadis use that verse, Sarva Kalam Idam Brahman, but Ramanuja, he taught that there is another word later on, Taijasa, I think it is. There's another word after the Sarva Kalamidam Brahman. And he says that things are one, but only in the same way that Brahman pervades, not that everything is identical, that Brahman pervades everything. And then there was another Neha Nanasti Ekam or something like that. I forget what the other verse is, where there Ramanujacharya describes the fact that there is no distinction. That's what usually the Mayavadis translate that verse as, that there is no distinction, but instead Ramanujacharya, he translates it as there is a unity, as he's used the Bhagavad Gita verse of as pearls are strung on a thread, that there's a thread, and that things are unified, all the pearls are unified through being strung on what's called a necklace, but at the same time they each retain their individuality as pearls. So this is some aspects of Ramanuja's understanding of this purified oneness. So anyway, that's the best I can do. But each sampradaya has an answer to it. And Lord Chaitanya united them all with, his dictum that we hear all the time, his dictum of Achintya Bheda Bheda Tattva. So that's how Lord Chaitanya unified all four different explanations, because Ramanuja came up with one, and from the Rudra Sampradaya there was another version, and from the Kumara Sampradaya there's another version of it. So all those versions had one, but Lord Chaitanya united them into Achintya Bheda Bheda Tattva, that we are simultaneously one with and different from the Lord. And of course this is Achintya, inconceivable, how that works. All right, so yes.
Thank you, Maharaj. I have a short question and a suggestion. Is it possible maybe next time when you give lecture to finish this and also to explain a little bit about these different conclusions of the different Vaishnava Sampradayas?
Okay.
I'd like to
Okay, the different responses to these Sarva Kalamidam Brahman Taijasa, and it even, our verse today, Soham, that's another, it starts off with Soham. So, that's another one of those famous Mayavadi verses. Actually, there are four Mayavadi Sampradayas, one in the north, one in the east, one in the south, and one in the west, So each one takes one of these verses and makes a Mahavakya out of it, an important saying out of it. And so Vaishnavas are constantly doing battle with these verses. Soham, Tatvamasi, thou art that. Soham, I am that. Or Sarva Kalamidam Brahman. Each one of these four directions. There's because Sankaracharya made four main mats, so that's why Prabhupada mentions it. Especially he discusses it in the Chaitanya Charitamrita in the Adi Lila. We get a lot of Prabhupada's rebuttal of impersonal philosophy. All right, so thank you. And
to add something, maybe you can comment a bit even next time. There's no time, but like we see that in different conclusions, more or less the word Advaita is always there. Like Shuddha Advaita, Vishishta Advaita.
Right.
So do you think that...
Dvaita.
Do you think this is because at that time the theory, the understanding about Advaita was already established? So no of the acharyas refuted it completely, rather was building a little bit on the top of it.
Uh-huh.
It was like that, or...
Well, right. Lord Chaitanya kind of synthesized them all together, but essentially they just kind of attack the same concept from a slightly different direction, you know. Madhvacharya was always kind of noted for doing this too. He was saying that no, that actually there's two, the Supreme Lord and the living entity. He didn't countenance the idea of there being one in any sense, you know. Of course, we understand that there is a one, and he did too, but he just was so strong against the impersonal conclusion that he just almost was a strict dualist, you know. So, at any rate, I think Kyle had a question, but maybe we'll...
We don't have enough time, which is fine. I just want to say thank you for giving class at least, so thank you.
All right. So, thank you all very much for your kind attention. All glories to Ramanujacharya, all glories to the Vaishnava devotees of the Lord, all glories to Radha Govinda, Hare Krishna.